There was a bit of an ambiguity as to whether we were, or as to whether I was, to prepare a paper to read or to prepare some thematic reflections to riff on. And although I have a paper, there won't be time enough to read the paper, and so I'm going to riff a little bit on some themes that have been important to me in thinking about reparatory justice. For a number of years, I've been thinking about both transitional justice and reparatory justice, and thinking about both of these contemporary forms of justice talk in relation to time, in relation to temporality, and it is in some sense the poetics of temporality in relation to reparatory justice that I want to, as it were, riff on conversationally this morning. The relationship between reparatory justice and our sense, and in particular our changing sense of the relationship between pasts, presents, and possible futures. It's always seemed important to me to begin with the observation that reparatory justice as a dominant concern in contemporary thinking about justice emerges in a conjuncture in which there has been a radical, I think, very radical reorganization of our expectations of futurity. Our expectations of futurity as change, and in some sense it's the temporality of change and changefulness and possibilities about change, in which I think reparatory justice is inscribed, that I want to think out loud a little bit with you about. I have 20 minutes. Past senses of futurity, at least past senses of futurity that seem to me of importance. The sense of futurity as a longing and expectation for progressive, even revolutionary change. A sense of revolutionary change as the overcoming of the past as discontent, or of past discontent, or the past as limitation or as discontent, has in some sense evaporated and has been displaced in some sense by a new sense of what I want to think about as the foreclosure of futurity. We live in a post-revolutionary world, and I think that is enormously important for thinking about the rise to predominance of reparatory justice, where once upon a time the future as a future that has overcome the past was the source of enchantment. I think we live in a world in which it is now the past that is a source of enchantment. Where once upon a time we were all, in a certain sense, aspiring emancipationists, we are, I think, in a very real sense, aspiring catastrophists. We are enchanted by the past in a way in which once upon a time we were enchanted by the prospect of futurity. Now, one paradigm, this is important for me in a variety of contexts, but one paradigmatic geopolitical site in which that old sense of emancipatory futurities was of enormous generative importance was in the historiography enacted around peoples of African descent in the New World. I keep using that phrase, African-descended people in the New World. And I recognize suddenly as I was making these notes this morning that I keep using the term New World, and I'm not sure what the implications are for thinking about that in a European context, and you will have to tell me. But a sense of emancipatory time, the experience of a story in which the slave pasts were connected to unfree presents in the direction of emancipatory futures was crucial to the story that peoples of African descent in the New World have told about the overcoming of the past in the present. That past in the present, leaning toward a future to come, was crucial for the romantic way in which the romantic poetics through which the story of pastnesses of unfreedom were told. So that older narrative that has now been displaced is to me a central building block of the way in which the story of peoples of African descent in the New World, the ways in which peoples of African descent in the New World have narrated their own story about futurities. That story of emancipatory black futurities is in crisis. Is in crisis not just in the Caribbean, but is in crisis, as we all know, in the contemporary continental African American present. I think that there is a fundamental way in which the slave past cannot be thought of as being behind us, but is in a real way before us. The legacy of the slave past, in a way that I think has not been the case for generations, is a fundamental part of the experience of the present. And it is what's fascinating and important is the doubleness of the conjuncture, a conjuncture in which futurities can't be thought of in emancipatory ways anymore, combined with the fact that the sovereignty project, in a certain sense, in the Caribbean, the anti-colonial sovereignty project, which was at a certain moment a cultural project about the reclamation of blackness, is itself at a dead end. And the re-rise of white supremacist politics in the United States that has produced the kinds of state violence that we've seen over the last 12 to 15 months measures the sense in which this is a conjuncture in which the pasts of slavery are very much part of our contemporary present. One of the ways in which it seems to me that the present can be characterized is to say that the great modernist story of emancipations, liberation, revolution, even good old social democracy, has been displaced by the age of human rights. I take this to be enormously important, that we live in an age of human rights. I think that this is simply an ideological fact, not just a fact, but an ideological fact. By that I mean that it is the normativity of human rights as the background in relation to which we think, and as the horizon toward which we think, defines in significant ways the way in which we think, or the way in which we are obliged to think about change. It is almost impossible, I think, to think the past in the present without thinking through, in some ways, the new parameters that human rights has brought into being. I think we live in a context reshaped by human rights, by the ideological fact of the universality of human rights. Human rights are our moral self-image. I say it and I put it this way because part of what I want to stress is that however much we may have strong doubts about the normativity of human rights, however much we may be skeptical about the normativity of human rights, for the obvious reasons, its implications in Western hegemony, global neoliberalism, humanitarianist interventionism, US imperialism. The facticity of human rights, the facticity of a changed discursive political landscape inscribed by human rights, means that in important ways to think against, if this is our politics, and it may or may not be mine, to think against human rights means that in important ways one is obliged to think through it. One has to take human rights and what human rights has made visible. One has to take it seriously, and take it to think the only way out is through, as one used to say in the good old days. One effect of what I'm calling the age of human rights has been a redescription of the past in the present, and therefore a redescription of what needs to be changed in order to create a better future. So one of the things that I'm interested in is the temporality of the conjuncture in which reparatory justice emerges as a modality or a strategy for thinking about change in the present, and, as we will see in a moment, the temporality inscribed in reparatory justice itself. Human rights discourse, I think, is enormously interesting, partly for the way in which it redescribes the past in such a way that it is connected to the present in ways that are very, very different from the ways in which, say, revolutionary considerations of the past in the present are described or were described. And crucial to this description, and these are, I don't mean to suggest that this is in any way comprehensive, but crucial to this redescription is that what once upon a time were thought of as social and economic subjugations and oppressions or even exploitations to be overcome, or more militantly, to be overthrown, are now reconceived as historical wrongs to be rectified or historical injuries to be redressed. And part of what I want to suggest is that the temporality of redress and the temporality of overcoming are significantly different in significant ways. This distinction between overcoming and redressing is the province of reparatory justice. It seems to me very important to recognize that, therefore, that the idiom and the model of reparatory justice are juridical and moral psychological rather than economic, social, political. That reparatory justice aims at repair, not transformation. That the domain of reparatory justice is rights, not freedom. And it reminds us, I think, in important ways, that the problematic that frames, that the larger moral, political problematic that frames reparatory justice is liberal, not to say neoliberal. What the implications of that are I think vast, and the story of discussions about black reparatory justice are indeed inscribed in a largely liberal discourse about the relationship between past, presents, and possible futures. In a certain sense, the rise of reparatory justice as a going concern is inconceivable without the rights revolution of Rawls, Nozick, Dworkin, etc. That landscape of discourse brought into being from the 1970s onwards is part of the background of the categories, the idioms, the very atmosphere of moral concern in relation to which we think the matter of reparatory justice. Which is, sorry? I have gotten nowhere, but 5 minutes. Which is not to say, so I haven't gotten to black reparations, which is where I want to get. So 5 minutes. So which is not to say that reparatory justice precludes futurity, but reparatory justice thinks futurity, again, not as overcoming, but as reconciliation, as the reconciliation of conflicted or colliding parties. And it seems to me, and that weighs heavily on discussions of black reparations. Okay, I have 5 minutes, so it's not possible to even cover minimally what it was I had hoped to give you just a taste of. So let me tell you where I want to go. I can have a little bit more? Thank you. Okay. So I want to paint this background of the human rights transformation as the context in which we think reparatory justice, and of the both, so that has a temporal conjuncture that reorganizes our conception of temporality. And part of what interests me in thinking black reparations is to think about a conception of reparatory justice that doesn't depend on what I think of as the blackmail of reconciliation. I think that a reconciliatory argument forecloses in ideological ways a focus on the past as a site of wrong that has not been redressed. That's not put exactly the way that I want to put it. But reparatory justice argues, and I take this seriously, that past actions are morally connected to present responsibilities, that the present has a responsibility to repair the past. That moreover, that past wrong, that unrepaired past wrong, remains wrong still. And therefore, that there is a moral obligation to repair the past, that grave violations in the past can't be superseded on grounds of a statute of limitations. And there are a number, as some of you may know, of thinkers for whom, Jeremy Waldron, George Scher, people like that, who argue that one ought to think of a statute of limitations on historical injustice, whether historical injustice around the appropriation or misappropriation of the lands of native peoples, or of reparations for the injustice of New World slavery. And but to argue in this way that past wrong remains unrepaired, past wrong remains wrong, is not to say that I think that slavery, which is what I'm most concerned with here, is a reparable wrong. I am not certain myself that slavery is a reparable wrong. I'm not certain that all wrongs are reparable. And it seems to me that New World slavery was a wrong of such particular viciousness, of such long-standing, of such callousness, and has remained so long unrepaired that I have a doubt myself that it is a reparable wrong. But that is also not to say that it isn't a wrong that hasn't to be confronted on the terms of reparatory justice. So very, very quickly, I imagine I have 2 minutes or a minute and a half. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, and we can talk about this later, in this context, is the temporality of a reparatory justice argument that seeks to bracket what I think of as the foreclosure of futurities, partly because moral philosophic arguments about reparations, as was pointed out yesterday, tend to be both backward-looking and forward-looking. These are terms that reappear all over the reparatory justice argument, that it is not enough to be backward-looking, one ought to be forward-looking. And I have myself, and we can talk about this, some doubts about the forward-looking argument. I have a worry that forward-looking arguments are a kind of sleight of hand to displace the past in preference for the future, to displace the past in preference for a future thought of as reconciliation or of equity. The reparatory justice argument, even sympathetic philosophic critics, and I'm thinking of people like Jana Thompson, whose work I think is amazing, will nevertheless say that reparatory entitlements are entitlements all things considered. All things considered. That is to say, one has always to weigh the past against the equity and reconciliatory claims of the present. And I am particularly interested myself in philosophic arguments like those of Bernard Boxhill that make a strong distinction between compensatory arguments, that are arguments about futurities, equity in particular, and reparatory arguments that are arguments directly concerned with injustices in the past. And what interests me about Boxhill is the way in which, in arguments that he's been making since the early 1970s, he has sought to decenter the futurity claim on the grounds, in a certain sense, that the story of peoples of African descent in the New World has always been, and this is where I will end, has always been a story about urging us to displace the present in preference for a future to come, but a future, of course, that never comes. Thank you.